According to Friedrich Engels, Shelley, the genius and prophet he was, found most of his readers in the proletariat, with the bourgeoisie owning only castrated editions, family editions, expurgated in accordance with the hypocritical morality of the day. This was likely due to the radical politics and atheistic tendencies he espoused, which in turn became the main reason for such small printings and limited successes of his poetry in his lifetime. Indeed, some circles had perhaps still not forgiven Percy Shelley for having been a class traitor. Shelley grew up in the ranks of the gentry, and his grandfather had become a baronet during his childhood. Despite this, most of his life was spent in radical departures from upper-class norms, and like most rebels, he became the family scapegoat, going into self-imposed exile in Italy, acting out foolhardily, and drowning at the age of 30. It is this journey, from emotionally and dutifully restricted and burdened aristocrat to free exile, that shaped Shelley's poetry. Born on the 4th of August in 1792, Percy was the eldest child of Timothy Shelley, an MP, and Elizabeth Pilfold Shelley. While attending Eton College, Shelley was, by all accounts, bullied and excluded, and, according to Bertrand Hooper, listed in the bibliography at the end of this video, he was labelled Mad Shelley and the Eton Atheist, and it's perhaps no surprise that Shelley chose to stand up to the practice of fagging, using younger boys as servants of the older ones, in a climate of punishment and physical abuse. Indeed, Shelley's refusal to participate, perhaps because of his own negative experiences, is reflected in his portrayal of sympathy that tends to be associated with sadness, something that significantly permeated his writing and is frequently linked to his first-hand experience of suffering. This suffering, according to the article Laughter as Sympathy, made the serious and sadly empathetic Shelley deeply suspicious of laughter, and he believed that, to some extent, it revealed our capacity to rejoice in the suffering of others. And while the idea that laughter is anti-sympathetic has a long history in Western thought, and stretches at least as far back as Plato's Republic, one might expect Shelley's interpretation to be down to such schoolyard taunting and exclusion. While ridicule naturally remained pervasive in the Romantic period, and is most obviously in evidence in its satire, as significant to the time as his enthusiasm for laughter's gregariousness, which it is felt might point to our natural benevolence. These contrasting strains can be heard in Prometheus Unbound. Early on there is the laughing malevolence of the Furies as they jeer at the Titan's suffering, telling him triumphantly that they will but laugh into thy lidless eyes, and laugh thee to scorn. The fourth act's vision of an unfettered world enacts rapture through outbursts of laughter, however. Ha ha! The caverns of my hollow mountains, my cloven fire-crags, sound exulting fountains. Laugh with a vast and inextinguishable laughter. The oceans and the deserts and the abysses of the deep air's unmeasured wildernesses answer from all their clouds and billows, echoing after. Though we have already begun to see, away from a form of comedy that ridicules, he does imagine laughter as a vehicle that has the ability to carry ideas and feelings, and to momentarily bring otherwise distinct entities together. It's noticeable, for instance, that Shelley's vision of sympathetic laughter in Prometheus Unbound takes place only at some future point after a radical socio-political transformation has occurred. Once Shelley progressed to University College, Oxford, Shelley, with the intention of becoming a Member of Parliament, might have been expected that he would change, though if anything his bravado or recklessness became more pronounced. The publication of his pamphlet on atheism sealed his fate as a figure on the margins of political legislation. Perhaps this is why, in the defence of poetry, he insists that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Instead, according to Morton, cited hereafter, Parliament's loss was culture's gain, as Shelley only became more and more interested in all aspects of literary culture. After Eton and Oxford, Shelley appears to have struggled to settle and spent time living as though on the run, if not from the law, certainly to those he owed money. His situation was worsened by quarrelling with his father and his subsequent elopement with 16-year-old Harriet Westbrook. It was a marriage that broke down in less than 3 years, by 1814. Shelley eloped again, this time to Switzerland with Mary Godwin, daughter of William Godwin, one of the radical authors he had read at Oxford. His unfinished novella, The Assassins, reflects their dreamy travels through post-war France, Switzerland and Germany, as does the Shelley's combined journal, History of a 6 Weeks Tour, printed in 1817. The summer of 1816 was spent on Lake Geneva with Lord Byron. Mary began Frankenstein, and Shelley composed two philosophic poems much influenced by William Wordsworth, The Hymn to Intellectual Beauty and Mont Blanc. Written during his journey to the Chamonix Valley, which had also been the subject of a Coleridge poem. Eventually, harried by creditors, ill health and social hatred, Shelley took his household permanently abroad to Italy in the spring of 1818. He stayed at Lucca and then at Venice, Este and Naples. By the spring of 1819 he was working on Prometheus Unbound. His life of escape and exile enabled him to observe at close range the different classes at work and play in England, Ireland, Wales, France, Switzerland and Italy, and perhaps this is the basis of how Shelley, the constant outsider observer, could be, at his most progressive and inclusive, pro-feminist, proto-ecological, anti-slavery, anti-capitalist, anti-homophobic, and against cruelty to animals, eating meat, and drinking alcohol. Amidst the loss of another of his children and Mary's subsequent mental breakdown, the 12 months from the summer of 1819 saw Shelley's most extraordinary and varied bursts of major poetry. He completed the fourth act of Prometheus, published in 1820, wrote The Mask of Vanity in September 1819, Ode to the West Wind in October 1819, the satirical Peter Bell III in December 1819, and his long political odes to Liberty and to Naples, both in the spring of 1820. During these travels, while engaging with a variety of cultural communities and developing his political position, Shelley began to augment his writing with crowd agitation politics and mass management strategies, with The Mask of Anarchy's famous appeal to the sleeping lions being an example of the former. In beginning to depict history as an evolutionary process driven by the struggle between the forces of tyranny and the forces of liberty, as in the Revolt of Islam, Shelley developed a technique that would, when combined with his message of peaceful protest, become influential in later years. In this respect, Shelley could have been inspired by Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Despite the fact that in its complete form the Crusoe myth poses problems for the Romantics because it functions as a moral justification for commercialism, colonialism, and political subjugation of agricultural workers, something Shelley is attempting to avoid. Instead, Shelley acknowledges Rousseau's discourse that the planting of corn has always been the original moment of social debasement and corruption in a nation's history. As long as they remain nomadic, cultivating land only to the extent that they feed themselves, people remain free. But as soon as they plant crops in a manner to generate a surplus, as Crusoe did, they create economic dependencies that inevitably lead to political iniquity. Indeed, according to Shelley, slavery and misery germinate and grow with the crops. The most prominent examples of this ideology are undoubtedly found in Ode to the West Wind and Sonnet, England in 1819. Both of these poems question whether poets should retreat from the corrupt world, governed by the interests of consolidated wealth, or should sacrifice their own lives to liberate and revitalise the dispossessed. Agricultural usurpation is among Shelley's most recurrent symbols in 1819 for political corruption because it works both figuratively. On the one hand, it works as a metaphor for all crimes against the poor, from excessive taxes to evictions to compulsory military service. On the other hand, it works literally, as the very means by which the government creates capital and a dependent labour force. In Sonnet, England in 1819, which addresses the Peterloo massacre, Shelley draws attention to the painful irony of a people starved and stabbed in the untilled field. Shelley also alludes to the connections between disease, socio-political relations and place, the argument being that Shelley saw the physical environment itself as a social product, and that the disease was the result of environmental degradation brought on by the excesses of tyranny. Michael Scrivener has summarised that Shelley, like Godwin, wanted to simplify the economy in order to increase the leisure of the poor and to shorten the working day. Though such a society has to be agrarian, it cannot permit the capitalist farming for profit. Agricultural must be freed from commerce, the real culprit of corruption. At this time, Shelley, while searching for solutions to what he saw as the governance problems in England, Ireland and Wales, he was definitely receiving motivation from constant news of England. It was on one such occasion, upon receiving news of the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, that he was stirred to write the volume of popular songs and political prose which the essayist and publisher Leigh Hunt refused to publish on the conservative grounds that its audience was not ready for the Mask of Anarchy. The Peterloo Massacre was of course an assembly of 50,000 to 60,000 working-class people that had converged on St Peter's Field to hear pro-democracy speakers Henry Hunt and Richard Carlile among others. When the crowd gathered, the Manchester town magistrates became alarmed by the size of the crowd and called in the militia to arrest the speakers. As the military forces entered the area, the crowd resisted, and as a result 18 people were killed and hundreds were injured. News of the massacre spread immediately throughout England, and public opinion leaned heavily towards outrage, something upon which Shelley had hoped to capitalise with his poetry. In The Mask of Anarchy, Shelley turns the triumphal parade's statist goals inside out by reimagining such an event as a ghastly apocalyptic display. This inversion of a spectacle is then enriched by Shelley's knowledge of the court masque tradition. Where members of the court were involved in a private but elaborate theatrical performances, masks reached an artistic peak during the reign of Charles I, and were largely designed to reinforce court power structure through highly allegorical performances. Though The Mask of Anarchy is not usually seen as tragic, the situation in the first 100 lines is in fact a portrayal of the tragic situation the people of England find themselves in. They are so ruthlessly oppressed that Hope herself is willing to lay down and die. In the historic moment, there was no democracy, and no way for the voice of the common people to be heard outside of protest, since they did not even have a vote. Shelley exhorts them to speak up and use the sheer size of the population to their advantage. In the poem, the spirit of Earth narrates the sins of the state, and in a fascinating passage reenacts for a second time in the poem the violence of Peterloo, this time more directly. Let a vast assembly be, and with great solemnity declare with measured words that ye are, as God has made ye, free. Let the tyrants pour around, with a quick and startling sound, like the loosening of a sea, troops of armed emblazonry. Let the fixed bayonet gleam with sharp desire to whet its bright point in English blood, looking keen as one for food. Stand ye calm and resolute, like a forest close and mute, with folded arms and looks which are weapons of unvanquished war. Here, Shelley returns to performative violence, enacting the tyranny of the state through the spirit's monologue. He is also sure to provide a solution, a course of action, that of non-violent resistance. Several more stanzas illustrate not only non-violence but also non-reaction. Shelley returns again and again to the image of stony-faced, silent yeomen facing down the militia, until finally the reaction of women reverses the actions of the soldiers. Every woman in the land will point at them as they stand. They will hardly dare to greet their acquaintance in the street. And the bold true warriors, who have hugged danger in wars, will turn to those who would be free, ashamed of such base company. And that slaughter to the nation shall teem up like inspiration, eloquent, oracular, a volcano heard afar. Indeed, by the time Shelley had travelled Italy, establishing a platform for these ideas, a radical base from where he could set up a new journal, the liberal was a priority and something he eventually began to do while in Pisa. The politics of the time and the politics of dissemination were important for Shelley. When will the social change take place? In a sudden violent revolution, or more gradually? And to whom should the revolutionary figuration be addressed? Questions that not only run through the more obviously political writings, like The Mask of Anarchy, but also through works like Ode to the West Wind. While there, he also became interested in the cultural history of Italy, intrigued by Renaissance Rome, and he met Prince Alexander Mavrocordato, the leader of the Greek patriots in Europe, someone for whom his friend Byron would later take up arms. Here, he also wrote his famous Defence of Poetry, published in 1821. In the spring of 1821, news of the death of Keats in Rome produced Adonais, and in the winter of 1821, Byron also moved to Pisa, and a raffish circle formed around the two poets. including Edward Trelawney, Edward and Jane Williams, and eventually Leigh Hunt, who came from England to edit the Liberal. In April 1822, he moved his household to an isolated beach on the Bay of Lerici. Here he began his last major poem, The Triumph of Life. His letters were still full of political hope and magically descriptive of the Italian seascape, but were nonetheless shadowed with personal premonitions. Perhaps sadly, it seems that without Christian faith, Shelley struggled to admit Dante's purgatorial vision of redemptive suffering into his own works, like The Triumph of Life, until a distinct change of outlook discerned in The Triumph of Life, strong in Dantean imagery. It can be argued that we see Shelley attempting to move beyond the cycle of punishment without end to admit the presence of some goal in the process of suffering. This poem is, of course, tantalisingly unfinished, and we will never know what Shelley's overall scheme was. When Percy Shelley drowned in the Gulf of Spezzia on July 8, 1822, he had just spent several days with Lord Byron and Leigh Hunt discussing their joint venture, The Liberal, the periodical to be edited by Hunt and published by Hunt's brother John Hunt in London. The meetings themselves had been long anticipated and, for Shelley, joyous. Shelley had not seen his friend Hunt in over 4 years, and though negotiations during the days Shelley spent at Byron's villa were sometimes ominously prickly, Shelley set sail with Edward Williams on the July 8th in an ebullient mood, having finally staged the coup of drawing Hunt to Italy and assembling an unprecedented group of contributors, including, besides himself, Byron, Hunt, Mary Shelley and William Hazlitt. Put another way, Shelley's death was less the culmination of a life than the disastrous interruption, uprooting the lives of his dearest friends and derailing plans over a year in execution. The costs of that death are captured starkly in Mary Shelley's letters and journals, in the demise of the Liberal and the dissolution of its circle, and in the many accounts of Shelley's death narrated by the various members. The general consensus being that, as per the quarantine regulations of the day, Shelley's death meant he had to be cremated on the beach, during which Shelley's friend, Trelawney, dramatically decided to pluck Shelley's heart from the crematory fire. It scorched his hand and produced a quarrel between Mary Shelley and Leigh Hunt over who had the greater right to it, and when added to the many accounts of Shelley's life published over the next decades, began to form the basis of the Shelley myth, the later excesses of which are famously captured in Matthew Arnold's representation of Shelley as a luminous angel, an asexual poet of juvenile politics and disembodied idealism. In reviews, the London Magazine, a monthly critical and dramatic review, declared Prometheus Unbound to be one of the most stupendous of those works, which the daring and vigorous spirit of modern-day poetry and thought has created. But not all reviewers agreed, and the division of the critical opinion, which began immediately on publication and still haunts Shelley's reputation, is perhaps best represented by the judgment of the Quarterly Review that Shelley's poetry is, in sober sadness, drivelling prose run mad. Some of the more tolerant and receptive reviewers came to recognise a major intellectual shift represented by Shelley's handling of the Promethean theme, as described by the perceptive reviewer in the London Magazine and Monthly Critical and Dramatic Review. Their view being that, where to Aeschylus the fate of Prometheus suggested the temporary predominance of brute force over intellect, the oppression of right by might, and the final deliverance of the spirit of humanity from the iron grasp of its foes, Aeschylus seems not to have placed symbolic meaning in Prometheus' deliverance. In Shelley's play, the deliverance of Prometheus is a symbol of the peaceful triumph of goodness over power, the subjugation of might to right. To represent vividly and poetically this vast moral change is the design of Shelley's drama. To this day, the contradictory reviews remain, and after Shelley's death, many struggled to accept his position and found him difficult to place. Wordsworth declared Shelley to have one of the finest ears of his generation. It was the faintest and most abstract of praise for a man who was otherwise unacknowledged. Later, Matthew Arnold remarked that to be beautiful and ineffectual is at once a tough spot for an activist, a typical example of the, for want of a better term, negative praise that Shelley often received.